Hello and welcome to the Church in Action program, where we talk with New England leaders about the imperative to make disciples, do justice, and foster unity to share Jesus to transform New England. This week, we're finishing our political discussion with Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond, Senior Pastor of Bethel AME in Boston, and Pastor Enoch Liao, Pastor of Boston Chinese Evangelical Church. We apologize in advance, our online recording platform had a few glitches during this episode. Nonetheless, we hope you enjoy.
The emphasis every year, and there were 2 years about climate and environmental stewardship, or loving your neighbor, loving your future neighbor, in terms of our planet. So I feel like if a probably conservative immigrant Chinese heritage church talks about the climate, then I feel like, and we're not like on the cutting edge of that. I think at least here in New England and Massachusetts, in Boston, we're thinking about the economy, and I do think we really need. Actually, almost everyone I know who bought a car in the last 3 years was trying to buy an electric car. It's just that, to your point, Charles, they're actually luxury items for the most part. But again, that's how it works. You have to make the infrastructure, and that's what you're paying for when you bought a Tesla 5 years ago. You're helping lay down the infrastructure, or get the government to give you the money to lay down the infrastructure. So I do think that is coming along. I do think there's an equity issue of, like Ray said, like the countries that are the biggest emitters, their moral argument is, well, you guys are high and mighty because you can make the transition to lesser fossil fuel burning economies, but you just spent a couple hundred years of our planet doing that, and now we're there. We can't go ahead and just get there. So, if the United States says no drilling here, drill somewhere else, actually, I think there are a lot of developing nations that would, we got to drill because we got to get through that economic stage of our country's development. Not that economic evolution is linear by any means, but I mean, that's sort of the thing. I guess the theory would be
cheap energy gets you out of poverty, and they would say it's unreasonable to say you got rich, now we can't, right?
But I think, and I feel like I read this somewhere, there is potential for leapfrogging. I mean, here's an example of leapfrog. I don't even know if that's the right term. I've been in various remote parts of the world for missions work or different things, and they have no infrastructure, but they've got cell phones.
There you go.
And so that's the kind of thing where, you've just left a bunch of infrastructure. They never laid cable. They never laid telephone lines. And they actually still do not develop roads. But they're very connected, and they can do business and trade and things like that. So I think there's a lot of excitement about what that looks like. But I do think it's about recognizing that, we have to direct resources and money towards new economies. And actually, like a big thing that a lot of people didn't know, at least in my town of Medford, was I think it's a Massachusetts law or federal law. You have the right to tell your electric company to charge you the same rate or something, but to use renewable sources. Like we did that in Chinatown. The campaign was just tell everyone you have the right to tell your electric provider you have to do that, and it's basically a comparable rate. And so from an environmental justice standpoint, there's no loss to you, but you know how hard it is
until a cloudy day that's not windy, then there's a huge loss to you.
Well, no, it doesn't work that way because it's more sophisticated than that, Charles. Like they are tapped into the same electrical grids, and that there's those responses. But the basic point is, even just getting them to call for all of these issues, it comes down to if it affects you. If it doesn't affect you, why would you do it? But that's why the Christian ethic, the theological thing is for almost all these issues, can you care about your neighbor if it affects them and will never affect you? And do you have the energy and time to learn and listen from their perspective, from their wisdom, even if you don't agree? And I think that's what's fundamentally the gospel contribution. We have a mandate from heaven to care about issues that don't affect us ever, potentially. And if the church does that more, I think, all these issues, justice of immigration, justice about environment, I just tell believers, pursue any of them, whatever God's calling you, as long as you're out there being salt and light.
Yeah. And I'm not a young person, but if I were a young person looking dispassionately at this landscape in front of us, I think there is an existential threat. But I don't think it's climate change, because I think business always, if they're left alone, they'll always find solutions to problems to make money. Right? That's what businesses do. They provide value to people by making money. So there will be an incentive for them to figure this out over time with new technologies, what have you. I don't think that's true with the national debt. I think that's an existential problem that we're just passing on to the next generation, and they should be mad at us about that.
Well, let me say two things. One, I wouldn't disagree with you. I think technology is going to be a big player here, but I don't know of very many technological revolutions that did not have governmental support. Deep governmental investment in basic research,
Yes.
early startup, and when it's too risky for people who have to report every quarter a profit. So I think the real model really is communal investment in our future that we then often hand off to the private sector and say, now really distribute this, apply it, make it available to people, market it, etc. And I think that's going to be the future here as well. I don't think it's either or at all. If I think about the biotech, if I think about high tech, if I think about railroads or any of a number of other things that we've done over the years, it's never been just the private sector by itself. And the best situations, I think, are often where, in fact, the government, all of us contribute in the early stages when it's quite frankly too risky for the private sector. And then it gets in some ways handed off. And I think that's going to be true here as well. But the question is, are we willing to make those early investments and bear the startup costs?
Yeah.
Some of that's going to be economic, some of that's going to be in taxes. And I completely agree. I'm not. I would agree with you wholeheartedly on this issue of the national debt. I mean, I do think it is a burden on future generations in many respects. I mean, again, the problem becomes, what should be the role of government? What should government be involved in? We got a wing of people who said nothing beyond national defense, right? Right.
And some wouldn't even accept that.
That's exactly right. So what do we think? And that has changed over time. That's as a nation, this has changed over time. We didn't get Social Security until the Great Depression. There was no presumption that the government should have a floor for workers or the elderly or the needy or the disabled. This is all relatively new thinking, which I would agree with. I think this is part of the care for the neighbor ethic. But under that rubric, care for the neighbor, you could pull almost anything under that, right? I mean, so what I would argue is that part of our challenge is to keep talking and sharing with one another about what does care for the neighbor really mean nationally. I can make all my own personal decisions or my family's decisions, but how as a nation are we going to care for the neighbor?
Yeah. And so since we're on debt, and we've just had an issue where we've taken on a boatload more debt in the span of a press release, President Biden forgave what's now being estimated as almost $1 trillion of student loan debt.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bunch of things in this, but biblically and policy-wise, can you speak to whether, absent this specific policy, is it wise to encourage people to take on a bunch of debt and then wipe off some of it and insulate them from the actions of taking on that debt or the benefit of it? And add to the inflationary pressure. Put that to the side.
So I obviously, we left the dock a long time ago when it comes to having genuine knowledge or expertise, at least me, on any of these topics. So speaking as a parent with a kid in college and Lord willing, a kid in college next year, it's the classic example where some family I know makes way more money than us, spent it all, living very comfortably, and they got a massive aid because they don't have the assets or the income. And then you have, other families like ours that are trying to save what you can, and then you get, and you're like, I know you make way more than me, but your kid got way more for school, and this is the way the system is. I think that's a really complicated question, but the simple answer I would say is, I think there's two thoughts. One, on the one hand, like your bigger question, of course. I mean, you could look at biblically Jubilee, the concept of forgiving debts, but your question's more like you don't want to enable that. I'm sure Jubilee was abused in the Old Testament. I'm sure someone thought, well, next year's the year of Jubilee, so I'm going to do something to my land or something, and it'll all get redistributed. I'm sure that's all there as well. But I think when it comes to the principle of debt relief, it's clearly in the Bible, and the burden is borne by others, and that's the redistribution. Whether that applies to a governmental system, to be capitalistic or socialism or communism, then I think that's a separate issue. But I do think that what little I've read about it, the indiscriminate nature of that, how do you apply a policy? Because you want to say, well, let's have all these guidelines so you can get this much debt forgiven if you do this or that. But then my understanding as a rudimentary person in government is it's just a simple guideline that is quote unquote common sense in a single household becomes incredibly complicated and burdensome when you try to apply that to a nation. And so I've learned that, it's a quote unquote dumb policy because it doesn't take in the nuance. But I think on a national scale, it's so hard to do that. So, and again, I'm totally not an expert, but we benefited from some of that student debt. We saw a little bit. We don't pay enough. This might offend some people or make some people feel sorry for it. We don't pay enough taxes to really get the full benefit of that. But I'm sure it's going to make a lot of people happy. But these massive and critical questions, I don't know. And there's the political thing involved with that, because this is on the way towards, some people would argue this is on the way towards free universal college higher education, which some people totally advocate and other things, dumbest idea. So I think it's hard to say what'll happen. But I do agree the national debt, I've always actually had a certain degree of concern and not guilt or anxiety, but conviction about it. And it seems like this is going to expose my naivete. Is this basically a government-sanctioned Ponzi? Like, I don't know. How does that work? Like, I don't even.
It may be, and it collapses. They all collapse eventually.
Yeah, so that's why, I don't understand. I probably just fundamentally don't get what the repercussions are when our government keeps incurring debt. And I'm not sure
inflation is for sure one of them because they just have to keep printing currency. So I think I see just a host of issues operating in this. I see the beneficiaries of this policy are predominantly people who are going to make higher incomes, Enoch, to your part, being funded by, or people paying the price of it, who never went to college, who paid for their own college, who did all those right things. So I think that's one issue. I think a second issue is, I think it's a real problem if one person, and maybe this will play out in the courts, if one person, President Biden, can spend $1 trillion with nobody authorizing that in Congress, nobody approving any funding. That seems to me like a real break in our system. I think it's always bad to insulate people from their choices, right? You get bad behavior when you insulate me from the downside of the decisions I make. I think that there's no limiting principle, because now we waived it for everybody who made up to $100,000. Why shouldn't we let people who have $105,000 in income not pay their debt back?
Right.
And then that becomes 110, and that becomes 120, and now it's just so, why is it only student debt? Why isn't it medical debt? And why isn't it consumer debt?
So to argue, because we're supposed to argue,
good. Go ahead.
I'm not going to really argue. I don't find arguments about the potential arbitrariness of drawing lines persuasive personally, right? Because you could say that about every law. And I think my point earlier is you make a case, for where that might be. And of course, you can always quibble on that. But I think the big concept is there. And there's always going to be someone that said we should have lowered the limit or raised the limit and things like that.
But just to be clear, my point is we will say that.
Yeah,
that's the next. That's step 2, then step 3, right?
Sure. I don't know. Maybe. I guess I don't know. You probably know more about this, but I'm not so sure. Because I think we have yet to see the political backlash of this, right? This is very recent.
That's a fair point.
So there might be a lot more political backlash about that.
Yeah, and I would agree. I'm concerned about the way it was done because I don't think you can build a wall on the border with a presidential edict or pronouncement, and I don't think debt forgiveness should be built on the same thing. I completely agree with you. And a number of Democrats have sounded that alarm as well, that, what goes around can come around. And what you didn't find tenable on these grounds for the prior president shouldn't change for this president.
Yeah, we seem, Ray, to be in a position where both sides want to say, this problem is so serious and those people won't do what I want. Therefore, I'm going to do it even when I've said I don't have the power to do this. I do it anyway.
Yeah, it's emergency powers.
Right. As opposed to saying, right. Yeah. As opposed to saying our system is, if we can't come to agreement in the House and the Senate that some majority, or in some cases a supermajority, if we can't agree to do something, we've decided to do nothing.
Right.
And that's going to be where, and now persuade other people to your opinion. We seem to have lost that in the conversation on almost everything. That's my observation. Is it right? Or
Well, no, I think that's often the case, and I mean, there's this again, as I say, gets back to our lack of trust, our division, our polarization, the sense that this or that party has locked up the Supreme Court, locked up the Senate or the House, or I mean, I think all of that has led to this kind of escalating set of measures in many respects that people are taking that are extraordinary. And prayerfully, we can come to some measure of accommodation before we go over the cliff. I don't know. We'll have to see. I mean, I think going back to the debt situation, I'll give you an example. I think the notion that we should help people with their education is certainly not new. It was the thrust of the whole GI Bill, which said not only should we help them, and the proviso was these are people who put their life on the line. Got it, right? They deserve a shot in education. They should have a nice house. Now, we won't go into all the racial overtones and who actually got the benefits and all that kind of stuff. But I think it was very appropriate. Although a reasonable question is, well, wait a minute. What about the people who stayed behind in the factories and provided the stuff? And why should they be paying, right? So again, I mean, we're constantly in these situations where we're trying to figure out what's fair, what's equitable, what deserves special consideration appropriately, and why. And it's not in any way a new debate. And I think the problem is if we don't constrain ourselves, everybody on every side just keeps pouring more in, whether it's corporate welfare or social welfare or defense welfare, military industrial welfare. Everybody just keeps pouring it because they, until we get a rude awakening that says this is no longer tenable. Unfortunately, we're just not there yet. And you hope we wake up before we get there. I'm not sure we will.
I've argued for years that we need to decide how much we should tax, what's fair, and then prioritize our spending within it. We don't want to do. And I've argued that the tax rate should be 10%, because I think if God can get by on 10%, we ought to be able to get by on 10%.
Yeah, that's a flat tax is certainly. Yeah, good luck with that one, Charles. Man, we kind of gave up on that back in the Depression, man, or just slightly before it. I mean, Steve Forbes others argued for. I mean, of those to whom much has been given, much is required. Is that a taxation principle? I don't know.
I was even mean just the 10% being the top end, even if it's progressive, 10%. If God can get by 10%, the federal government ought to. And keeping in mind, God doesn't get 10% because we won't give it to him sometimes, right?
I hear you, man. That could be a biblical argument. Why should the government get more than God? Right? That's a fair statement, right? Even if it's progressive, fair enough.
So, guys, thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for talking about these issues that aren't always easy and aren't always in our sweet spot, Enoch, to the point you've made a couple of times. But that's the American public, right? We're not all experts on every single issue. And we're not meant to be. That's why we have representative congressmen and senators. And their job is to be the experts. Even when it doesn't work, that's the system. And so we're meant to stand at a bit of a distance and make our best assessment and live our lives and not be obsessed with the politics. So I think it's okay if we don't know everything about every issue. So for what that's worth, for what I think is worth, that's the story. And so one of the things I think some of us struggle with is how do we vote when we've got a candidate who we don't like the character of and we mash up with what we believe as Christian. But the policies actually are quite good, or the policies are no good, but the person's character is quite good. And so how do you decide what to do with your vote in that situation? Let's assume we have politicians with good character. I'm sure they're out there someplace.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think that's what's been leveled in the last several cycles, right? From all sides, because there have been Christians that have backed presidents from both parties over the years. I think there's a theological tension, or not tension, but tendency, where people say, well, if you look at like the pastoral epistles, it's all about character, all the qualifications of elders and deacons, character. But actually, there is a qualification based upon ability, and that's really less about qualification, but really more about calling. So if you're called to teach, you're called to preach, you're called to lead, those are all things that I think it's both. The perennial question of character versus competency, I feel, is a false dichotomy. In fact, that is how we solve the problem of evil philosophically. How can an all-good God who knows all things allow so much evil? The traditional answer now is to basically, well, God must not be all-powerful. Or really, he allows so much freedom that he wouldn't stop the evil. And that's really what a lot of progressive Christianity has today. I think it's a false dichotomy. And I think you probably have to weigh in every situation, and it's hard to quantify, but I think you'd have to take every consideration. I don't think it's easy to say character alone. The classic example is, do you want character alone for your surgeon or your pilot or your mechanic? You might say, well, no, if they have good character, they wouldn't fix your plane. Fair enough. But you want competency alone without character, because if they don't have the character, they might shortchange you or they may not fix it properly. So I just think it's a false dichotomy. And I actually do I think the whole lesser of two evils may not be a very useful frame of mind. I'm not sure what a better one is, but I think it comes back to what Brother Ray said, who we still love and may not be on the video, but he's still with us. He's working on something for his microphone. But I think it's you just do the best you can. And when I disagree with your decision of what's best, ideally, if we have a chance, I'd love to learn why you picked that and why that would be the case. So I don't have a simple answer. I actually really think the Bible resists that. In fact, Jesus is so frustrating, right? Hey, do we have to pay taxes? I mean, that's the great example, right? And Jesus said that, which Ray already said, render to Caesar what is Caesar, God unto God. I love that line because, first of all, it's just Jesus is showing his mastery in terms of teaching and his thoughtfulness. But actually, I'm really still not sure what exactly that means. I think that's a great line. And so I think if someone says, can I just vote on character or vote on competency? I think, no, I don't think you get to do that. I think you have to weigh it each time. And there's no easy heuristic to make that work.
I think it meant that believers then had to pay their taxes, but that doesn't apply in all times and all places.
I'm struck that whether we're dealing with pastors or presidents, we're always talking about trade-offs in a sense. And the question is, how deep are the deficits versus the strengths, especially in a political context here, if you will, in a secular pluralistic democracy. And I'd agree with Enoch's point about the lesser of two evils. Someone said this before, and I just don't know who to attribute it to. It may have been on one of our discussions in which they made the point that we may find ourselves in lesser two evil situations, but we're really in trouble if we develop amnesia and ever forget that the choice we made was evil. It wasn't, we can't whitewash it. We have to be clear about it and more than ready at any point to stand up and address the evils that we see, even if it was the lesser of evils. So again, I think this is a very hard situation. I've never had a candidate, never, with whom I agreed on everything, sometimes quite strongly. But again, I'm recognizing that I live, that candidate's position also represents other people in this country, city, wherever it might be that I live in. And the question is, can we find a way to live together despite those differences?
Well, we'll find out. Sorry. But guys, thanks. These aren't easy issues, and they're not always easy conversations, but I think we demonstrate we want to. We can talk about these issues and disagree in love and grace as Christians. And I didn't hear you guys say anything that was crazy, evil, or stupid. I hope you didn't hear me say anything that was. But you might have. I'm crazy sometimes.
Well, you did, Charles, but I didn't want to say anything about it.
We'll add it in the show notes afterwards. And we'd like to thank Jess Mangano, our producer. We'd like to thank our listeners and hope this dialogue helps us be the people of God, reflecting the love of Jesus even in political conversations and even when it doesn't go our way. Visit visionnewengland.org and for past episodes and resources. And we've had a number of these conversations with Pastor Ray and Pastor Enoch, and you can hear those. Click donate to partner with us to accelerate evangelism in New England. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Luis Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.